Hi there, I'm Andrew Free from CFO On Call, and today I'll be sharing with you a case study in pricing for a services business. It follows on from a webinar that I presented on pricing for a services business and goes into a bit more detail in the case study. It would be helpful for you to look at that webinar first. It's available on the CFO On Call website as a recording, and it might give you some background that will be useful as we go through this today. So, what are we talking about today? We're talking about an inbound call centre. And before you groan, this inbound call centre was providing an important health triage service. So what this was a national service across the whole of Australia on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis. It was funded by the federal government, and it answered phone calls from people with health issues by agents, as they're called in inbound call centre terminology. And these are all health professionals. These are trained nurses and other types of health professionals who provided important interventions for people with health issues over the telephone. So what are these interventions? There's various levels of intervention. For the very early part, the not very difficult issues, telephone advice would be sufficient. For a slightly more important issue, if they felt it was warranted, the advice would be take a painkiller and rest, see if the issue resolves. And then if it does, no further action is needed. If it doesn't resolve, then you should see your GP. For more serious issues, the advice would be go and make sure you see your GP within 24 hours. If it was even more serious than that, the advice would be go and attend the emergency department at your hospital as soon as you can. And for the really dire and urgent issues, call an ambulance. And in fact, what would happen is there would be a hot three-way call, as it's termed in inbound call centres, whereby our agent would ring the ambulance service, stay on the line with the person who called in with a serious health issue, and stay on the line with them until the ambulance service is there and providing care and assistance. So you can see, high levels of intervention will require more intervention or more time from the agent on the telephone, and that was reflected in the way the service was structured. So how do you price for a service like this? Well, as discussed in the webinar, there's various elements of pricing for services. First is getting a true total cost of the employees providing the service. Secondly is finding what the costs directly associated with providing that service are, other than the human costs. Thirdly, the availability of the employees providing the service. I'll explain exactly what that means. Fourth, the utilisation of the employees providing the service. And again, I'll go into further explanation. And finally, the fixed costs of providing that service. So let's look at each of those elements. First, there's the true total cost of employees providing that service. These are the normal costs you associate with employees. Wages of salary, their own costs, their superannuation, payroll tax, annual leave, all those normal things that you associate with employees. But very importantly, in this particular instance, was the recruitment and training costs. In this service, we moved from having agents working in a bricks and mortar call centre to having them working remotely from their home. So there was additional cost in the remote training and recruitment of staff. The other big factor was there are two industries that have amongst the highest turnover across any industry. One is call centres and the other is health. Put those two together and you have a very high turnover rate, around about 50%. So that meant, in real terms, about half the people we had answering the telephone, we would lose over every 12-month period. So obviously our recruitment costs were high and our training costs were high. And I've outlined that there were two very important factors to be taken into consideration when pricing for this particular case study, because those costs were much higher than in a normal business, even a normal services business. Secondly, costs directly associated with providing that service. Meals, accommodation, travel, tools. Now, because of the fact that this was a remote service, these were not as high perhaps normally you would have. But in the area of technology and insurance, they were much higher. So technology, because you had people working remotely from home, you had to put more technology into their workplace so they could be in contact with the call centre, make sure the calls were routed properly, that they were handled properly. And so there was more technology costs associated with the employees. And the professional indemnity insurance for a health service is very high. So both of those factors were unusual and high in this particular instance. Thirdly, the net availability of employees I talked about earlier. So this is where you measure out of the time you're paying for, 52 weeks a year, how much time are they actually available to do work? So 52 weeks translates to about 1,950 hours per annum. Once you take allowance for all the types of leave, annual leave, long service leave, public holidays, etc., you only end up with about 39 weeks, 1,467 odd hours available to actually do work. Now, not every year will all these numbers be the same. So you need to work out for your particular business what those factors are. But what's important is to take them into consideration, understand that even though you're paying 52 weeks a year, you're only going to get a certain number of weeks, around about 39, maybe a bit more, a bit less, where they're actually doing productive work, chargeable work in the services business. Then you've got the utilisation rate. Even though employees are available to work for those 39 weeks a year, 1,467.5 hours roughly, they can't actually work 100% of the time. It's too much of a call. Some industries it can be higher, a bit lower. In the particular instance I'm talking about, 85% utilisation is considered the maximum. In this particular instance on the screen, I came up with 86.7%, but it will vary upon yours. But in this case study, it's 85%. And I'll explain a bit more about that afterwards. Then you've got the fixed costs of providing the service. So these are all the normal types of fixed costs: staff costs for admin and managerial staff, advertising, marketing, building rent and outgoings, energy, etc. In this particular instance, three things were important, different, because staff were working from home. The actual cost of the bricks and mortar was lower, the building rent and outgoings are lower, the energy costs were lower, but depreciation and amortisation were much higher because you had extra technology to provide the ability to send calls to the remote location and have them handled, but also because it was a health service and the risk factors and the training factors, all calls were recorded to ensure that protocols were being followed, the risk management was being followed, that staff were responding appropriately, and also for insurance purposes to demonstrate what was going on. So you put all those factors together and you can start to do a pricing model. Now, an inbound call centre, there's some very important variables. The variable factors for staffing an inbound call centre are call volume. That's the number of calls by the half hour, which is how you staff an inbound call centre, on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis, which was the service that was being provided. The call length. So this is the average length of call expressed in seconds. As you saw from the interventions earlier, depending on the severity of the call, the length of the call can vary quite dramatically, from quite short to very lengthy. But when you have a high volume of calls, the allocation across those interventions becomes reasonably stable. The average length of call becomes reasonably stable, and you can work out what that average call length for the service is. Then there's what's called the service level. And this determines, based on the call length and the call volume, what sort of service level you're going to provide. And when you look at inbound call centres with an important service like this, 80% of calls answered in 20 seconds is the standard level of service. You can go to higher, 90% in 10 seconds, which is a very high level of service. But to ramp up from 80-20 to 90-10 is a huge increase in staffing costs. You can go lower to 70-30, 70% of calls answered in 30 seconds, but the reduction in staffing is nowhere near as dramatic as the increase in staffing going up service level. So 80-20 has been decided as being an appropriate level of service where staffing is not too high, but it is providing a high level of service for what is an important health service. Then you've got shrinkage. This is the equivalent of the availability, but instead of being expressed as a percentage of time available, 75%, in call centre terms, it's shrinkage, so 25% shrinkage. So that's the reduction in time that an agent is actually available to accept calls. And then maximum occupancy, which is the call centre way of talking about utilisation. It's saying this is the maximum amount of time an agent should be on the phone out of their available time answering it and handling calls. If you go above 85%, you burn people out. They don't respond appropriately. They can't do their job effectively. So 85% is the accepted maximum level of occupancy in an outbound call centre. So you look at all those factors. This is how you determine your staffing. Looks pretty complex with that number of variables. And you're right, it is. Fortunately, over a century ago, a very clever mathematician called A.K. Erlang worked out a method and a formula for putting all those variables in and telling you what staffing you need to answer the calls based on all those factors. Great lifesaver for CFOs like me who are working in inbound call centres. It made it possible to work out what your staffing was, and then you could plug that into your pricing model. So let's look at what that works like. Here's an example taken from the webinar of the pricing for a services business based on hours. So from the slides earlier, we saw that there was 1,272 billable hours. We worked out based on salaries and on costs that the total cost of the employee per annum divided by the billable hours is $157.23. So those cost per service per employees is $200,000. So there's $200,000 per annum is your cost for the employee. And that's it expressed as an hourly rate. Fixed costs of $1 million, investment of $3.5 million. So to break even, if you had 10 employees, your break-even price is $235.85. That gets you to effectively a zero profit and no return on investment. So how do you make a profit? If you increase that hourly rate to $260 that you're charging for each of those 10 employees, you end up with a $307,000 profit, 9.3% profit margin, and 8.8% return on investment, which looks pretty good. If you found that there's resistance to that price, $245 is a better price per hour for the services you're providing. Get to 12 employees charging those rates, you'll end up with obviously higher revenue, higher costs because you're talking about 12 employees versus 10, slightly higher actual gross profit in dollars, even though your margins are slightly less, but you've got the same fixed costs because they don't vary with the number of employees, same investment, slightly higher net profit, extra $32,000, slightly lower margin percentage-wise, but a better return on investment. So in the webinar, we thought this was a reasonable profit and return on investment model in terms of those employees. So how do we translate that into a price per call? You work out how many calls per hour those employees can actually answer. So for example, you've got 1,272 billable hours. Each hour, they can answer 7 calls on average, depending on those average call lengths. So per annum, that's 8,900 odd calls per employee with those same 12 employees. So now you're talking about volume in calls, not volume in hours. Price per hour becomes a price per call, $35 an hour. Pretty simple, take the 245, divide by 7, you end up with $35 an hour. Your cost per call goes, unit costs go from per hour to per call, $22. Same revenue, same cost of service, all the numbers roll down are the same. It's just that you've translated from saying, I'm going to charge you $245 an hour to $35 per hour call answered. These are not exact numbers from the case study because they're protected information, but it gives you a feel for the type of way you can price your service in a different way, rather than doing it saying, I'm going to charge you X dollars an hour, I'm going to charge you X dollars per call. Depending on your industry, there might be other ways of doing it, but it's a way of expressing your services in a way that may be more acceptable and understandable to your client. So I think, and I hope I've shown you that it is possible to price for a service, even a very complex service, with the types of resources that are out there. If you need some assistance, we've got lots of experienced CFOs at CFO On Call that can provide you the sort of assistance with pricing issues and any other finance-related issues. So just a reminder, you can contact CFO On Call via the website, as you can see on the screen, cfooncall.com.au. You can arrange through that website for a free chat with any of us, the CFO On Call partners, to discuss your pricing if you want to do that, or anything else finance related. And in that chat, you can find out how we can help you. Also on the website, there are lots of resources to assist you. There are ebooks and other blogs and information for all sorts of issues to do with pricing, costing, cash flow, and other issues that affect small to medium enterprises. So you're very welcome to log onto the site and see in what way CFO On Call can assist you. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you've enjoyed the case study today. Thank you for your time.